Let's discuss this question of what is synchronicity. Synchronicity seems to be a concept that is very much talked about in spirituality. And different people have different views of it, and different people try to explain it in different ways. And I'm going to be another person who gives you their own view of what synchronicity is. Because for me, it's such a fascinating phenomenon. And I think it actually describes how life works. It describes that life works in this intelligent, sequential, and synchronistic way. And there's a way that we can actually align with life's synchronistic intelligent flow versus interfere in it. So when we're acting from our mind, from our ego, and we're seeking, psychologically overlaying life with a seeking energy, then we're actually interfering with life's most synchronistic flow. I think life is still synchronistic even when we're interfering. It's just that it has to include that interference. But when we recognize that the seeking energy of the mind in us and hopefully learn how to let it go, how to see it and not act it out, how to release it, then what remains is life's most synchronistic flow. And that's when we actually begin to notice a lot of these beautiful and sometimes very surprising coincidences. Because that intelligent sequence of events is actually is most visible because we're not interfering, we're not messing with the sequence. So for me, synchronicity is what remains when we get the mind out of the way, when we're not seeking. So in the absence of seeking, synchronicity remains. And we begin to see a lot of things kind of line up, and something that I'm thinking about shows up in a movie that I spontaneously choose to watch, or something that I'm reading ends up echoed in a conversation I'm having with a friend, or a need that I have ends up being fulfilled in a way that I didn't expect. So life seems to be functioning in this very relevant and intelligent way. In fact, this could be one of the main laws that I've noticed life works by, which is the law of relevance. People talk about the law of attraction as well, and it's kind of the same thing. It's just not something, the law of attraction implies the fact that you have to use it. You have to actually egoically try to think things out and feel them out and try to attract them in your life. And I would say that that's still done by the mind, by the ego, and tries to force things. And from a more mystical perspective, more non-dual perspective, we could say that life is already attracting what's relevant for us. So it's already functioning by the principle of relevance. For me, relevance means the right experience at the right time. So we're always functioning in that way. And then when we recognize actually the mind and the ego and its seeking impulses and actually release them, get them out of the way, right? Out of the way, out of the great way, out of the Tao. So we get the mind out of the way and we don't let the mind interfere in the flow of the Tao. Then again, what remains is this relevant synchronistic flow of events. And we begin to notice these synchronicities everywhere. I remember the first time I started observing the possibility that life is not random and that life is actually potentially synchronistic. I was in the US, in Napa Valley, in California. So near San Francisco, there's this wine country of the US. I went there with my previous partner which was my wife at the time. And so we moved to the US for a few months, for 6 months. And at the time, I was learning two things. I was learning to trust life and to follow my joy. In fact, to trust life so much that maybe it's okay to not follow my fears, but actually let life move me through my joy. So as I was doing that, I was observing things really take care of themselves really well. It was a beautiful story, actually, those 6 months in the US, which actually ended up becoming a book, a spiritual memoir, because after we came back from the US, I started kind of thinking about the story and how beautifully things worked out there, and how synchronistic everything was. That I was telling the story to different people, and they were saying, well, this should be a movie or this should be a book. And then, I ended up writing a book, and it's called If I Knew I Wouldn't Worry. So if I knew that life would take care of itself, then I wouldn't worry. So in the US, I started noticing this phenomenon of synchronicity. I was listening to some channeled materials at the time, which were kind of new for me. And I was kind of skeptical about the channeled nature of those materials, but as I started getting into them and kind of appreciating their wisdom, their value, I was kind of opening up to the possibility that, there could be these interesting multidimensional sources that are sharing some information with us. And one of those sources was Bashar. So it's a channeled source called Bashar, which is a man by the name of Daryl Anka, who has been channeling this multidimensional being for like 40 years now, 30, 40 years. And this teacher, this source, talks a lot about synchronicity. So at the time, I was kind of fascinated by the concept, and again, I was also at the same time learning to trust life and live in flow, and kind of let life move me, surrender basically to the flow of life, let it move me through what I feel like doing, through my intuitive joy. So I was very much in tune with the flow of Tao, very much in sync. And I decided at the time, when I was kind of experimenting with this idea, to try a bit of an experiment, a challenge. And I woke up one day and I said, okay, life, if you're really synchronistic, I want to see 10 synchronicities today. And without going too much into detail, I ended up actually counting 10 or 11 or something like that, different coincidences, some bigger, some smaller, but everything that would kind of show up as like, that's interesting, I would count it in. I wasn't very scientific, very kind of rigid in my way, but I wasn't trying to force things into synchronicities either. So, for example, I would be reading something in a book, and then I would talk to my friend Reno from Canada at the time, and he would mention the same thing that I was reading, for example, or I would I would be thinking about something or experiencing something during my day, and I would go to the cinema, a very small local cinema there, and I would watch a movie, and I would see a lot of the things that I'm thinking or experiencing during that day in the movie. So there are a lot of this kind of coincidences at the time, and that day, that little experiment showed me that life is potentially not random, and actually the more we surrender, the more we are in this seeking energy of the mind, and more in the flowing, being lived, being moved energy, the more of these synchronicities kind of show up, and we notice them everywhere, like in also repeating numbers, which I'll touch on a bit later in the video, because that's a whole topic, and maybe it's going to be another video, the whole idea of repeating numbers, which I've been seeing a lot lately, actually. in the last few years. So that day I tried this experiment with, okay, life showed me 10 synchronicities, and I was living in this kind of fluid way and trusting life, following my joy, and I saw 10 or 11. And it surprised me so much that at the end of the day, I was like, this is weird. Like, this cannot be true. So the next day, I was like, okay, let's raise the stakes and let's really test this out. And I thought, okay, God, kind of like, okay, Google, show me 30. If this is really true, I want to see 30 synchronicities today, not just 10 like the previous day. And again, I was living at the time, and since then, actually very much in tune with life. And I ended up counting maybe 25, 27 or something like that, which were, again, small things, bigger things, more kind of striking examples. Just to give an example of a small one, I would drive my wife to work, and, for example, I was driving back home, and the same car, just like mine, at the time I had a white Honda CR-V, kind of like a little Jeep, and the same car would be in front of me, a white Honda CR-V. So that's an example of a small one, right? And I just shared a few other examples of more striking ones. Kind of like I'm thinking something and somebody mentions the same thing, or like things like that. So after that little experiment, the first day and the second day, again, I wasn't very scientific, nor I was trying to force things into synchronicities, but still I was shook a little bit. This idea was planted in my mind that maybe life is not as random as we generally think it is. It's actually more intelligent and, like I said at the beginning of the video, more sequential, more synchronistic. And actually, we can align with the Tao, you could say, with the flow, the synchronistic flow of events, when we surrender, right? When the seeking energy of the mind is not leading us. And that's very difficult, actually. I mean, it's a whole spiritual journey and a whole spiritual process of awakening out of the seeking energy of the mind, which is very strong, generally speaking, because the mind is very insecure. That's the ego, the insecure self, and it's always seeking for security and actually outing out of effort, not ease, not just being moved, but trying to make life work, trying to make life happen. So it's moving life rather than surrendering and being moved. So this is it's a big conversation, understanding and recognizing the nature of the ego or the mind. But again, for simplicity, I wanted to introduce this description that life is already synchronistic, and when we get the seeking energy out of the way, synchronicity becomes all over the place. It becomes the norm. And I've been experiencing a synchronistic flow of events, ever since, the whole story from the US, which actually happened maybe 6-7 years ago, that we were in the US, and then, we came back, and 2 years later I wrote this book, the spiritual memoir, and since then I've been, because at the time I was a relationship coach, and I was in my long-term relationship, and I let go of both of them, and I entered a bit of a transition from ego-led life, from mind-led life to Tao-led life. And I've been in this transition for the last 6 years, learning to surrender and really kind of going through my spiritual process, you could say, of ego dissolution, ego awareness, ego dissolution, and just letting life happen by itself, letting life live me, but also dissolve me, right? The conceptual self, so that only life remains. So anyway, this can get very mechanical, very confusing and complicated. But yeah, I just wanted to introduce this possibility that we can align with the synchronistic flow of life when we get our seeking energy out of the way. Hope this made some sense, and yeah, you can play with this idea of surrender and begin to notice more of your own synchronicities as well. And maybe in other videos I'll make some some more, I'll share some more stories of how synchronicity manifests in my life these days as a lot of numbers, a lot of repeating numbers, and how they actually have different meanings. So each sequence of numbers has a certain meaning, but I can share that more in a different video. All right, hope this was useful to you, and I'll see you in another video.